The following is an encore presentation of Benjamin Balderson at Flatoberfest 2022 in full high definition. Up next, we have a first-time presenter with Flatoberfest and Flat Earth Festivals, and he is Ben Balderson. He hosts a show called Odin's Alchemy, and he's got a very interesting presentation for you on the electromagnetic universe. All right, give Ben a round of applause.
Hail! Welcome to Flatoberfest. I'd like to, the trip here was pretty rough. It started out with our dog getting attacked by a Belgian Malinois that randomly showed up, and so that put us in a hurt. So there was a bunch of fans that helped get us here, including Miss Georgia and Annie D and Karen B. And I'd like to thank Karen B for putting this on. I'd like to thank the Weaving Spiders for helping me put this together, and of course Jared, my producer, because we all know that I am absolutely handicapped at the computer things. So thank you guys. And so a couple years ago, I don't even remember how long now, a guy named L.C. King, some of you guys might have heard of him, he contacted me, and at the time I was going around and talking a lot about alchemy and how actual lab alchemy works, and comparing that to some of the different philosophical things that they've been putting out there, because as time has stretched by and less people are doing the actual lab work, which is what the philosophy is derived from, the more that the philosophy veered away from the reality of what's going on in the lab. So I had been talking about that, and Lucas contacted me, and he had been working on this concept where the world is an entire battery. And some of the things that he said just really caught my attention, and I immediately started talking to him. And him and I have been working on this somewhat, some together, some separately, ever since then. So I'm calling it the biochemical electromagnetic flat earth. Not exactly a catchy name, but so here's a fairly basic representation of what we're looking at with it. Now, when you're looking at it here, we live basically where this line is in the center. Underneath, there's going to be a fairly similar bubble to up top. That's where, when I'm talking, I don't necessarily call it a flat earth, but we live on a fairly flat plane, the plane of manifestation. I hope everybody enjoyed Austin's talk, because a lot of mine is going to go with it. Some of it's going to go hand in hand. So we live on this plane of manifestation. So where so many of us recognize the dome above, there's also the same basic shape underneath as you see with the toroid, and when you're living on the plane of inversion instead of a plane of manifestation, which is what I would call it from an alchemist point of view, that it's going to be the same basic shape. So in this, when we were originally looking at it, the world is then basically a galvanic cell. And so the galvanic cell, the way that's going to work here is you've got a positive cathode and a negative anode. Now, the positive cathode is going to be a slightly more stable metal than the negative anode is going to be, because the two are going to, this is the way they're chemically going to have to work, okay? Then you have what they call a half cell, so you can see that very mild line in between the two electrodes. And so what that's expressing is there's a different solution on the positive side as opposed to the negative side, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Then there's a wire connecting the two in between, and we have the solution itself, which is going to be an electrolytic solution, or what they would call a salt bridge. Now, the way this is going to work is that the negative anode is going to ever so slightly degrade. And when this happens, and I'm going to use the mainstream terminology, but with the understandings that Austin just talked about, it's the same exact thing. I view it slightly different, but it's the same basic principles. But we're going to use their terms just so I don't have to, I didn't expect Austin to basically give that right before me. So I thought I was going to have to explain a whole lot more just to get to that point. The negative anode, the particles of that are actually going to split apart. And the electron portion of it is going to jump on this wire and shoot itself over to the cathode. Then that's going to free up the positive ion, and the ion is going to float out into this electrolytic fluid. And because now the electron has went over to the cathode, and that has changed the charge of the cathode. So now it has a slightly more negative charge, and the ion portion that's getting released into the fluid is positively charged, so it gets immediately drawn to the negative, or to the cathode now, where it's going to bond back together with the other portion that already split apart. Because the two things are still one the entire time, and as Austin is explaining, there's a field in between, which he was calling ether, and that field's fluid, so this is happening through this fluid. The two are still one, and they're just going back together. Now, in this, what I as an alchemist would call this electrolytic fluid would be mercurial fluid, and it always has a positive aspect and a negative aspect, because mercury is really neither. It's the messenger. It's going to take from one side and give to the other side. You can call that a transaction. You can call that anything, and that has to happen inside the mercurial fluid. It can't happen up in the open air up top. The mercurial fluid, at this level anyways, needs to be there, so it's also setting the bounds. And that's why mercury sets the bounds of things, because that transaction can only happen where the mercury exists. So, is my thing going black? So these two, inside the negative side, that's going to actually break apart, and then it's going to go back together on the positive side. One of the easier ways to explain that is like with the human body. With the human body, when you take in water, which is you're going to be oxygen and hydrogen, that's doing two different things. The oxygen is oxygenating things like it does in anything else in the world. So no matter what your cells need, whether it's trying to get down to minerals, or a lot of people understand that we take in glucose, and that we live off of glucose, but we really don't, because the glucose is a stable molecule. We need to break that carbon piece out of the glucose in order to make it unstable, so that way it can bond with our body, and then the oxygen carries that carbon out, and you exhaust that out in waste. Well, now that we've got that down to the ATP is what that's called. Now the ATP needs to bond into your body, which isn't the negative side to mercury anymore, which was the oxygen in the human case, because you can use a bunch of different acids in these different batteries and bases. But then hydrogen is what's going to create the bond and allow the transfer of that inside of your body. So whether it's the ATP or whether it's the minerals that you're taking in, when your body goes to bond it back in, that's happening through the hydrogen, so that's the plus side of the mercury. And so this is the whole same basic transaction that's happening with this battery, which again, everything we talk about here is going to tie back to the body, tie back to the world. Because as an alchemist, I'm sure many of you have heard it said, as above, so below. Everything works the same. Or in the newer age terminology, everything's fractals. So a fractal is the exact same as the thing that it's derived from. Or even the new science terminology where they use the word quantum. Quantum is just the smallest particle that still is identifiable as the whole. So if it's like a gold particle, after you break it up enough, you can't really tell whether the pieces that are making that up, and again, today's science terminology, protons can be anything, neutrons can be anything, electrons can be anything, but it's a certain exact combination of them that makes it a piece of gold. So the smallest piece of that is your quantum piece. Anyways, so it's all going to be exactly the same. It's going to be as above, so below, as the old alchemist said. So this is going to be your so this is what Lucas and I started out with, is your biochemical electrical universe. Now in this, we have the sun as the cathode side, and that in and of itself is going to be an entire thing that we had to go through. Because the sun is acting, as far as the way actual lab work goes, the sun is acting in a very feminine manner because it's being the receiver here. Where the moon, the degradatory side of it, is acting in a masculine manner. So there was an entire thing where since the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's been a whole lot of inversions put into things. And when I started really looking at older cosmologies that predate that, and it's funny how things from that period are always called ancient, but when you look at things that are actually ancient and predate that, almost every cosmology has the sun as feminine and the moon as masculine. Where you have, like, I'm an Odinist. So in heathen cosmology, the sun and the moon aren't actually even gods. It's a brother and sister, Sol and Mani. Mani's a boy, Sol is a girl, and they're put up into the sky. So, and you look at First Nation peoples, actually women from the full moon will expose their genitals in order to ensure pregnancy because the moon's masculine, and they're trying to take in this masculine energy in order to ensure that they are fertile and get pregnant. So, and then also when you look biologically, women are very heavily affected by the moon. Especially in this community, we're very parallel with a lot of pagan, like myself, and witch communities, things like that. And the women are very, very drawn to the moon. And at one point, women's periods were called their moon cycle. And before the intervention of all the different chemicals, drugs, things like that were taken in, there's a lot of people that would say that it was matched more to the full moon and the new moon. Whereas opposed to as a man, the sun controls your bodily reactions down there, and every man wakes up with he's ready to wake up. He's not the first thing up, right, guys? So, and only my wife gets that reaction besides the sun. So, so that took quite a while to actually work that part of it out. So in this, you have the sun as the positive cathode and the moon as the negative anode. And the moon is degrading and feeding into the sun and sending the sun its energy. Now this is happening in a cycle that also is matching the cycle, some of the things that we just talked about biologically with humans. And at this point I gotta stop and explain quickly that as an alchemist, each of the luminaries is represented by a different metal. And there's very good reasons for that. Biologically, as a human, it works that way. The light that they express, the light spectrum, this is how we know things like the moon is silver. So the sun is gold, and the moon is silver as far as an alchemist goes. And then we have Mercury, which is Mercury, pretty on the nose with that one. Mars is iron, Venus is copper, your solar plexus, Jupiter, that's tin, and then classically the Saturn is the other one that's really known, and that's lead. So again, we're going to have to get back into that in just one second. So the moon is actually silver particles. And part of why the moon is the one that really looks solid is because as those silver particles soak in radiation, the radiation makes bonds in between these silver particles, which makes it look rather solid. And they actually use this same technology in cameras and in solar panels, the way this silver soaking in this radiation and doing this. So it starts forming these bonds that look rather solid. It's not really solid, but it rather looks it. And so the moon sits and soaks in this radiation. And then once it's full of this radiation, and now it's actually subject to degrading, because when it was in its smallest particle, the smallest particles don't break apart, or else they just become separate pieces. So it's at its smallest place. Well, now it's all bound together and it's subject to degradation now, where we're talking about it separates into this ion and this electron. So then the one goes over and shoots over to the sun and impregnates the sun, and you have this entire gestation period where the ion is then going to go over and meet up with the electron. And at that point, then this energy, because we all know from fairly mainstream science that fusion energy is much greater than fission energy, so that the spark of energy that was released when the particle was broken apart at the anode is not near the energy that is derived from when it's put back together over at the cathode. And that energy is now able to be used to do different things. And if you look at it as the sun's now in the morning in today's vernacular, a lot of people look at it as like Ostara energy, that first morning sun energy that's really very life-giving and carrying a heavy load of gold and giving life to all of us. Excuse me one second, my throat's getting dry. So the moon is impregnating the sun, and after the moon is full and does its impregnation, sends those pieces over because it's degraded, which again, all the different stories that have the moon as being degradatory and being your dirty side and all that, that's because the moon is literally degrading, and we can see oxidation on the moon when we look at it, and it matches oxidation for any other electrical item where you get that. So that's actually degrading, and then it goes flaccid until it builds up the energy again, and it goes through this cycle, and then it's going to do that. So where the moon is getting this other energy then is the way we looked at it was from the other luminaries. And by luminaries, the ones I'm talking about in this system are only the wandering stars, as opposed to the fixed stars that rotate with Polaris. And we're going to get into that in just a minute too. So when the wandering stars are rotating around and doing their transactions, and you can see the very electrical nature to that even when you're talking about astrology, and anybody that's an actual electrician, you understand that three-phase where power goes 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, this works. But when you try and make that fourth and try and put an actual phase in there, now they're going to smash into each other. And that's where you're going to have problems. And like astrologically, when things square as opposed to triangle, you have problems, but the triangle is a very desirable setup. Let's see here. And so here we've got the sun, and the sun is going to be, again, gold. And one of the other things that's going to happen, this isn't just one type of power that we're talking about from the biochemical reaction that's happening. We're talking about a number of actually different differentials. And anytime that you want to have power that you can derive, in order to have power that you can derive, you have to have that differential where these things have to split apart. And that way you have a polarity. When you have a dead piece of iron that hasn't been polarized, the piece of iron is just a dead piece of iron. You polarize it, and now you have a magnetic field, you have energy, you have life. This life is derived from polarity. When you look at a heart monitor, there's that dead center line. It's called dead center for a reason. It's that dead center line. And if you're alive, it goes up and down from that center line, not just up, not just down. It's an up down. It's a perfect oscillation and a balance between the two things. So when you're talking about the differentials, the light from the moon, because the moon is silver that's sucking in radiation, it's not actually giving out the same type of energy as the sun. So that's actually a cold light that's coming off of the moon, and that's just a luminescence that's from that radiation where them energy bonds are releasing in the silver, and it's breaking apart and giving off light. It's also the sun is also going to be the hydrogen side, which once again, the hydrogen is your plus side where things are getting put back together. So that's going to be a hydrogen derived side. And as things are getting distilled out from the warmth, and you're getting that warmth cold differential in the world, adding that into the battery, then it's actually creating a distillation, a world distillation. So some of these elements, such as hydrogen, which is your very finest element, that's going to get clear up into the atmosphere where it's going to drive some of these reactions, and the sun's causing that through a distillation. And that distillation is also causing a breakdown and a refreshing of the salts in the system and everything else, so it's very much needed. Now the moon, again, is going to be cold, and as opposed to warm, which is going to cause those things. Another reaction that you're going to get is on this cold side, during the day, your mercury, your oil, your liquid, it all starts evaporating and distilling off. On the cold side, well, that's where it gets put back together. And this is something that gets used by any kitchen witch, any basic alchemist. Anytime you want to do something, you're just all distilling is taking a mix and heating it up, and when it hits its vapor point, it vaporizes off, but then you want to cool it back down to liquid, so then you cool it back down to liquid. Really very simple. The other thing the moon is going to be is a base rather than acidic. And the thing that makes the difference between base and acid is actually hydrogen. A lot of people don't realize that pH actually means potential of hydrogen. So on the moon side, or on the sun side, where things are wet and warm, feminine, it's going to be very full of hydrogen and very acidic. And on the moon side, it's going to be caustic base. So that whole thing where immediately when we think acid, we think something that can break something down, but all that is then the heavy acids, where it starts getting further away from 7's actually your dead center on pH. And so when you get further away from that, you get more acidic. And on the base side, you also end up with a caustic base that's going to eat up things just the same. So on the base side, you're going to, this is what's going to be degrading the moon. So here we're going to get into my tree of life and start progressing where this is starting to progress to today. This was a gift to me from Odin, Hail Odin. And he gave me this key, and I've spent 5-6 years now working out how this works and applying this to the world. So the typical tree of life is going to be like any of these trees, and there's actually 3 here that you can see represented. The colors don't really mean anything on this chart, so don't get too worked up about that one. It was just what color markers I had at the time. So this is your typical just representation of a tree, and even when you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, there's pieces of it that are missing. And I was actually out speaking with just out meditating on the side of my mountain. For anybody that doesn't know, I live off grid. I live clear out in the mountains. We provide our own power, our own water, have my own animals. I milk my own cows, all those things. So I was off on the side of the mountain, and when Odin talked to me, this tree of life, all 3 of these were swirling in my mind, and he said, I'm not one mind, I'm 3. And that was it. And that was the entire message. So I had to work it out from there, and I started noticing, so when you put these things together, especially as an alchemist, and that's where I went first, because the lab is where I understand things. There's truth in the lab. If I can't, and you know, science used to be like this. But at one point in time, if I thought something was a certain way in science and I had a theory and I proved it, I would tell my friends about it, and my friends would then go into the lab and do the same experiment. Be like, yeah, dude, that's how it works. That wasn't peer reviewed where you just, yeah, buddy, that's how it works, right? Somebody actually had to do lab work. So normal science was at this point at one point. But again, like I started out with, where the term alchemy can even be thrown at anything without any understanding of it, is because there was a drift away from the lab. So when I started running it through the lab, anytime that as an alchemist that I want to take and break something down, and everything works exactly the same, the easiest way to look at this is then going to be with spagyrics. So when I take a plant, and they throw a lot of big words at it. I'm a hillbilly guy, so I don't use a whole lot of those big words. I do understand them, but I don't use them. It's just not in my speech. But they use the prima materia. So all that means is whatever you started doing your experiment on. If it was a lavender plant, then fantastic, it's a lavender plant. If it's a cannabis plant, if it's a piece of gold, if it's a dog, whatever it is that you're working on, that's the prima materia. And that prima materia represents this entire, all 3 of these. All 3 of these trees is the entirety of the thing when you start out. So as an alchemist, what we're going to do is we're going to break those things apart. And in doing so, I'm going to remove the things that are undesirable, and I'm going to put back together the things that are really desirable and marry them back together in a way that nature did not do it, bringing it to an epitome and making it much more powerful. So I'm going to take this prima materia and I'm going to break it down, and I'm just going to mush it up. It went from this beautiful plant into this just pile of dark, nasty mush. And from that, and there's a number of different ways you can do this extraction. You can do it the natural way, and you can ferment that plant out, and it's as it's breaking down, because plants are going to break down no matter what, and you're going to try and break it down in an anaerobic environment rather than aerobic, which just means without oxygen as opposed to with oxygen, where it's going to mold. You're going to try and break it down anaerobically, so yeast is going to do the breakdown, because nature can't be denied. It's going to find one way or the other, right? And you're just kind of controlling which way. So you're going to break it down anaerobically, and at that point the oil is going to get separated out from the rest of the plant because of the alcohol. Or you can just take like 99 proof Everclear is going to be your most desirable. What we're doing is this alcohol is something called a solvent, and a solvent is the negative side to mercury. And what the negative side to mercury, just like the battery that we were talking about, and just like that explanation, the negative side needs to create a breakdown. It needs to rip something away. In the battery instance, it was the electron, and it was breaking that down into an electron and an ion. And in this case, it's going to pull out the sulfur and the mercury, or the plant oil is going to come out with it. Now, at that point, you're going to separate those two, usually with just a basic strainer, and you're going to have a mixture of plant oil and alcohol, and then you're going to have a pile of real nasty mush. So you're going to take and break this mush pile down. You're going to throw that into a crucible and hit that with real hot fire and put that through what we call the nigredo process is the start of that, and a lot of people are going to recognize that. And you recognize you do this a lot. You know, anybody that burns their food when they cook occasionally, you've seen the start of it where your food automatically turns black, and it's called the blackening. And that's because the carbon, or the thing that was the earth portion that was binding all these things together, that needs to come out. So like when you're looking at these three trees, right now this purple tree is going to be your sulfur and oil tree. The blue tree or teal tree is going to be your carbon, water, and cellular material. And then your villi tree is going to be, or the orange one, is going to be your salts, your cellular salts. And the thing that we're going to try and get rid of, and again, like Austin alluded to, there's so many different philosophical connections you can make to all these things. So this one's the ego that you're trying to burn out, the thing of this earth. The carbon of this earth is carbon of this earth. It's going to go back to the earth. The cellular material is the cellular material. As a heathen, Odin made us from trees. We're the same basic cellular material as he showed in his presentation. You can make so many parallels to the stump of a tree looking just like your thumbprint and everything else, and that cellular material is just going to break down into ashes to ashes, and it's going to go back to the earth and be reused. And the same is going to apply to the water. The water's just the water. The thing that's different in all these plants is going to be, or people or whatever, is going to be the oil and the salt. So that's actually the purities of you. So the things that we're trying to burn out is this carbon, water, and cellular material. Well, the water was the first thing to burn out. You didn't really see that, but your material might have gotten drier if you dried it. Now you're seeing this carbon leave. So this carbon's coming up to the surface. Carbon's very interesting. When you're looking at this, the dead center line, that where everything's dead center, which would be the heart chakra or the plane of inversion or the plane of manifestation, that's actually carbon. And carbon's super weird. It's normally kind of a solid a lot of times. It can even be crystalline, but then when you hit it with heat, it goes liquid and it actually vaporizes, as you're going to notice when you're burning away your plant material, that all of this carbon is going to turn black, and as you keep hitting it with fire, it's going to vaporize off and just disappear, and that pile is going to get smaller and smaller. You can take this giant plant, and by the time you're done burning it down, it's shocking how little ash and how little salt that there is. And then from the ash, you're going to mix in distilled water, because the distilled water, the water's actually acting as a mercury again, and it's acting as a negative mercury, and it's going to take the salt out of this mixture and incorporate it into itself, because that's what solvents do. They incorporate things into themselves. And you're going to then filter it out to get the ash out, and then you're going to evaporate off the water, and you're going to be left with your salts. So that's going to be your first tree. Your orange tree down here is going to be your salt tree. Your salt tree is going to be your density, the thing that you can really grab onto, your material side of things. That's your masculine side of things, your ice. As a heathen, the way the world started was there was a Niflheim, the world of ice, Muspelheim, the world of fire, and these two are both masculine things. And then the thing that's not is Gununga Gap, which was the great void that pulled the two things together. We call this cavitation today, and pulled these two material sides together, which actually were always the same thing, but were separated into a polarity, but then needed to come together in this field, and then that's replaced by liquid or fluid, or whether it's gas, fluid, whatever. So, and that's where life came, was where the fire and ice met. So this is going to be your ice side, your salt side. Well, then we're going to take and we're going to throw the alcohol and oil mixture into a lembic, which is just a sealed glass vase, and we're going to put some heat to that until the oil, well, first thing that's going to vaporize off actually is the alcohol, because alcohol, the solvent's always much more unstable than whatever you're putting it in with, so the solvent's usually pretty easy to get back off. That's one of the things that you, when you start really doing the lab work, you start really paying attention to, is what solvents do what, whether they're stealing carbons, what temperature they come back off of, especially with plant stuff, because the plant oils, they're very delicate, and you want to do that as cold as possible. So you're going to burn off this alcohol or whatever solvent it is that you are using. Myself, I like butane. Butane vaporizes off very easily and keeps a lot of the oils intact. You don't need the heat that you do with alcohol. But even if you're doing it with alcohol, first the methanol will come off, and then the ethanol, and then you're left with the plant oil in the bottom, and there's still going to be some oil in the alcohol. This is why you distill alcohol 7 times before it's clean. So the oil is going to be what you're left with. It takes a lot of heat to get alcohol back out, so I like doing it, like I said, with different solvents. But the oil that you're left behind is what counts. Now, when you start doing this a lot, one of the things that you really notice is, just like with cooking, if a spice has been sitting up in your cupboard for way too long, then that spice doesn't have any flavor left. That is just dead. And you're going to find that with any of your plant materials, and this oil is what you're trying to pull out. And so you're going to start learning a lot of things about oil, just like we talked about with the moon, where the moon's pulling the oil back up and making the plant more oily, as opposed to the sun, which is making it more dry as the day goes on. This oil is going to be the most in the morning after the moon, and especially the full moon. This is part of why you're supposed to pick plants in the morning of the full moon before the sun comes up. When the sun comes up, you're going to notice that your garden smells infinitely stronger. And that's because the terpene level of the plant, or the very most unstable level of the plant, that's all it took, was that just peak of the sun in order to make that burn off. And that burning off hits your nose, and depending on what it is, like if it's food type things, your mouth will start watering, your stomach will start gurgling, your body's opening up pathways, because that's what the oil's job is to open up pathways, and we're going to get into that in just a second. And so you're going to notice, though, when you pick a fresh plant and you do that extraction, and the colder it is, the easier that is to do it fresh. Like at this point, I extract typically at about negative 150. And at that point, that freezes the water inside of the plant, and then the solvent's able to pull the oil out while the water's left behind, because the oil's not water soluble, so you're using a solvent that actually takes out the oil and goes right through the water, and you can actually extract your oils out while the plant's basically still alive. So you keep them super volatile terpenes. But you're going to go ahead and pull out that oil. You're going to notice that when it's fresh plant like that, it's got this yellow tinge to it. And this tinge, when it's super live like that, has a vibrance. It's literally like neon when you see it in a collection bowl. You hit it with light, and it just screams back at you with life. It's so amazing. Well, when you let that plant sit there, as it sits there, the color inside of that, or what I would say is the sulfur element, it starts turning colors, and it'll go from a vibrant bright yellow down into a dull yellow, and to an orange and a red, and then eventually it just turns black. And the reason I say that that's the life in it is because like if this was a cannabis plant, you can extract out the terpenes, you can extract out the CBD, you can extract out the THC, and each one of those things is very clear. And you can be left with this mass of just color. So this is something that you can remove. This is the sulfur element, and that plant is dying as it's sitting there. And if you macerate the plant, like you grind it up, that life leaves so much quicker. And it just becomes very noticeable after doing a whole lot of extractions. So that life element was always sitting inside of that oil. So that sulfur is actually, as an alchemist, that's the other half besides the salt. So this top tree up here is now going to become your salt tree, or your sulfur tree, and this bottom tree is going to become your salt tree. And this middle tree, now that we have burnt it out, and as an Odinist, that would be Odin sacrificing himself to himself, because all three of these pieces were the prima materia of himself. And the thing that he sacrificed was the ego, this carbon body, this carbon experience that's happening on this plane. And once you burn that out, now this, as we talked about with doing the actual process, this oil side and sulfur side, they want to rise up and they want to vaporize, they want to leave. That salt side, when we put that to fire, that fell down out of the ash. That became more solid, more itself when you hit it with fire. We have two very opposite polarized reactions. And that was what was driving the whole system in the first place, was these two polarized things. But now that the carbon body is not holding them together, these two polarized sides don't want to be together either. And so it's the mercury's job to make that happen. And now we got to switch over to the positive mercury, which actually is the oil. This is part of why in my tinctures I don't actually use alcohol in any of my tinctures. The alcohol is just acting as a solvent at that point, and so it's going to be a delivery system. You can use butter, you can use any kind of a carrier oil, just depending on what the material is to break it down, or DMSO, that breaks down anything. You can use all kinds of different solvents. Alcohol is a negative one that takes away, and I'm not trying to take away at this point, I'm trying to fuse. And the oil is what's going to do this fusion job. So these two polarized pieces, they were always one thing. And the sulfur is the big light, that's your sun, and then the salt is your little light, and that's your hidden light. So a lot of people know, like, your story of Pollux and Castor, and Castor's the bright shining one, or the sulfur side, and then Pollux is the degrading side. But Paul means hidden, and Lux means light. And so Pollux is the hidden light, and the two are actually just a split or a polarization of the same thing, and they need to be back together in order to become one union, because it's actually one prima materia. And those were just fractal pieces of the prima materia, because as above, so below, and we'll explain this in a second, each one of these things breaks down the same. So what's supposed to happen is through this mercury, the sulfur, this life, is going to transfer into the salt, and it's going to free the trapped souls that are in hell. And that's why it's always tied to a block, chained to a block or a stone or something like that. It's going to free those trapped souls in hell by enlivening that salt. And now it's all going to coagulate together into the stone of whatever plant that you were working on originally. Now that it's in this configuration, it's going to have a nice solid materialness to it that the feminine side did not have. It's awful hard to grab liquid, or the sulfur side, which is even harder to actually quantify and measure and even see. And on the same token, when I put heat to it, now as the stone, the masculine side, the salt side, will actually evaporate up with this feminine side. So what we've done, and this is why it's called the alchemical marriage, is we've married this masculine and feminine side, and now they're showing the best attributes of both sides at the same time. Excuse me. And that's all going to happen, again, through the Mercury, where these two are merging. So that's why the Mercury is making the transaction, doing everything like that. So that's the positive portion of Mercury, which is entirely different. Let's see here. And when you look at this, one of the ways I also like looking at this in a prima materia manner, this is no different than building a house. So as you can see, it says engineer, contractor, and parts house. And this is the way we start looking at everything as an alchemist then. And it kind of puts your ether theory and the more materialistic view together as one. This side's going to be your more ether side, and then this side's going to be your material side, and it's where these two are coming together that you have the combination and things to come together perfectly into the stone, into the perfect union. This is where Odin becomes a god. He did not originally start out that way. That's why he had to go through the trial on Yggdrasil. Let's see here. So here we're going to talk about the other side of things besides the degradation side. So obviously, as we're looking at things, part of the reason that the world is getting where it is obviously as a battery needs to wear out. Or doesn't need to, we'd all like it not to, but it's gonna. Eventually the anode's gonna break down enough to where it's not able to do this transaction anymore. So then, while we're looking at it, what happens to any battery when it runs out of power? We charge it up. We throw a heavy charge of electricity into the battery, and that then is going to take this cathode, and it's going to actually break apart the cathode and reverse the entire system. And this part is super interesting. So here's where, if everything has broken apart and become one with the cathode, which at that point is the sun or gold, now here where we send electricity into it, it's going to do the same thing and go through an electrolysis process and break these things down into their component pieces, and it's actually going to flow over, and the cathode is going to start charging up or rebuilding that anode. And the way we were looking at the other luminaries at the time was they were just going to be simple plates in between the two. So then this process would continue. The moon would then feed the other plates until they got rebuilt into their entirety. And so that point in time, then Saturn actually would be the sun, because the sun itself, or the cathode, is acting as the most anodic. It's actually breaking apart and giving instead of pulling in. And so the sun would basically become the most anodic, and then the most anodic thing would become the most cathodic, because that's receiving energy, not giving anything to anybody else. And so then Saturn would become the sun. And so that was very interesting, but something about that whole system just didn't quite work right, the way we were seeing it. And I already even knew here that there was going to be a crystal side that's going to match what we're talking about here, which is going to be your sulfur side. Because again, with the three trees, what we're talking about with the luminaries, when we're talking about the sun and the moon and the wandering stars, is just literally the sulfur tree. The Mercury is going to be everything in between us that's making that energy able to reach us, the fluid, the vapor. And then the salt side is what's actually going to pull toward it. That's going to be underneath us, where the crystal side is. Dielectric up here, magnetic down here. So these two are always going to be seeking each other, and we live on that plane in between where the two are meeting. Well, as that moon, so when we look at this as an entire cycle of the world, if the battery is charged up, and that's right here at the very top, which is your gold age, and it starts cycling down. We know that as it cycles down, when we look at your handheld cell phone, your computer, whatever else it is, when the battery is completely full, everything works great. Everything is sharp, crisp, you hit buttons, things happen really fast. Well, as the battery starts wearing down, it's not pulling up your apps quite as fast. It's just not processing near as fast. And you're looking at maybe the silver age then. And then when you get down into this bronze age, now your apps aren't even really opening up anymore. You hit one button and another button, like you hit a T and it types B, and you're like, what? How'd that happen? So you end up down into your Kali Yuga where the battery is basically dead. And I like how these are exactly across from each other, because at that point, everything on the right-hand side is going to be galvanic. So everything on the left-hand side is going to be an electrolysis, where you're turning around and you're recharging the whole system. And it's obviously going to start out, once again, and the battery's still pretty much dead. If you plug in your phone, just like when Austin was up here, we tried to get his computer plugged in and going again, but it was too far gone, and it needed some time to actually charge up before things were going to function right again. And it gets some charge in it, and it's going to start functioning a little bit until you get all the way up into the gold age, where things are great and your battery's all the way full. You reach that full spot at the top, you're going to unplug it, quit charging it, and you're going to be again still in the golden age for a while that battery wears down again. So, and you see this, it matches up with a whole lot of cosmologies. I really like using the heathen cosmology, because I'm a heathen. So when you look at this, Ragnarok in and of itself is the 9 realms all line up. And it's 7 realms in Germanic as opposed to the 9, but most people know the Norse, which is the 9. That's just a whole topic in and of itself. But either way, the realms line up. And then Surt, the giant of Muspelheim, the leader of Muspelheim, drives his sword and rides his fiery army through the 9 realms and burns them all to ash. And then everything gets washed back over with water. And then the world returns green and lush, and there's fruits of everything, and no man planted it. And we even have the return of men, which anybody that listened to the talk, Crow, he was on Crow, Matt Powers was on Crow, and on my show, where he talked about DNA hiding in the land and things literally appearing when the conditions are correctly, that this DNA starts pulling back together and just doing what it does. Just like that, Lef and Lefrasier were waiting in the mud for the right time for humans to return back to the earth, and they did. Why is that doing that? So he drives his army through this and burns it. Well, this is an electrical reaction. This is just a hard charge going into the system. And even when you look at the battery, when it really starts wearing down and the salts start attaching themselves to the plates, and it's called sulfation, you have to put a really hard charge in it to make that dispel. So there's even another thing after the battery gets more hard wore down that has to happen, and that will actually break off the salt and put a full charge polarity into the system again. Because when the systems dies, it's because it's a loss of polarity between the two things. So you can see that as a hard charge that's getting driven through the system, and then the electrolytic fluid has to wash back over, or the mercury has to be there in order for it to actually have life, do something. So this story matches with a lot of the different cosmologies that happen. And once again, once that hard charge has happened, the whole system just starts online again. Let's see here. And here's where things start taking a turn on us. So as I'm working on this whole system, and it's still not quite coming together for me. One of the things that I noticed, because as above, so below, all these things are supposed to work together. And all the chakras, the way they're supposed to sit, and the way the luminaries were supposed to sit. Well, if I add the sun and the moon into the whole system as the cathode and anode, that already throws us off for more than what we have, and it didn't quite match. And then furthermore, when Lucas and I were looking at things, and then another gentleman named Mario Garza, it seemed to us that the sun is not quite what we think it is. That's not the end of the system. So when I'm looking even at charging things up, the anode and the cathode, that's not where the electrical charge comes from, nor where it goes to. And there's a singularity that's happening right there. So we started looking at Polaris, and coming to the understanding that Polaris actually has been displaced by the sun as the head of things in almost everything. And it's really very interesting. And this one, I'm actually, as we all know, I'm not Christian, but this is actually from the 1560 Geneva Bible that was banned by the church, banned by the King of England. That in and of itself is a pretty interesting story, where that Bible was produced. And this picture here is Ezekiel's dream. And then in 1599, the church had another Geneva Bible printed, which they approved, and it had a bunch of changes in it. And then King James outlawed that and made his King James Version Bible. But this one's out of the very first English translation. So we can see in Ezekiel's dream here that we have the firmament, and there's something sitting on top of it. And actually there's a table of contents that came with this. This thing was amazing to see. I couldn't touch it, but I got to take a couple pictures of it. And so up there centered is what we would call God. And when we look at the way the Gnostics saw things, one of the things that they were trying to do was overcome the effects of what they call the archons. And the archons were just the wandering stars. And the wandering stars still does include the sun and the moon, because the ones that are the fixed stars, the ones that don't ever really change the way that they move, and they move in perfect precision around a singular point, well, those are different. And so they were trying to overcome the effects of the wandering stars and not the fixed stars. So the way they saw things, then Polaris would have been God, or and then again there would be another salt side to things, because once again that's only the sulfur side, and there's a salt side that matches things. So we had to add Polaris into the entire system, and then from Polaris is derived the sun and moon. And those two are where the polarity lies of that center. And it's really very interesting, even when you start looking at the biblical story from that sense, where if they put Polaris as God and Lucifer as the great shining one that comes every day and blinds us to God, and then falls, and when he's gone, there's God sitting there, Polaris, and never moved, same place, whether we could see it or not. So we had to add Polaris into the system, according to all of that. And that really made things interesting, because we all know that we have a certain set number of planets, and now we're adding a whole bunch of things into the whole system. Right here. And so that just kind of threw me off, and I kind of left that to the side a little bit and started working on my tree of life again. And from the tree of life, obviously, when you're looking at the tree in and of itself, that is just the masculine side of things. That is the salt side. That's the line. We needed to start adding the feminine side into things when we were looking at the tree of life. So adding in the flower of life over top of the tree of life, we start seeing a lot of things start jumping out, like these three eyes. And we start understanding that the way the tree's put together, the center eye is your ego eye. That's the heart, the center where the sulfur side and the salt side meet. And we have your all-seeing eye up top, and that's going to be your sulfur side. And that side is, just like in the way the tree is set up, is the engineer side. And the engineer knows a lot of things and has a lot of ideas, and it's all about change. And they have a lot of high ideas. And then on the bottom side, though, we have the Vili tree, which we can all look at Vili, and it says vial in the way it's pronounced in English, and the way the Christians have things, and so many other cultures, that salt side is demonized, where it's just a polarity from the other side that was required to have life. So we have the salt tree, which is actually one with that sulfur tree before it came apart and got polarized. And that's going to be your all-powerful eye, where you have the material side, because you can't put together that thing that's on that engineer's piece of paper without adding in the material. If I came up with the cure for cancer today, I would need to go get all the materials, and then third thing I would need to do is put them together, which is where they get manifested and actually become something useful, something we identify with on this plane, the plane of manifestation. Well, that's where your contractor is, who takes the materials and takes the plans and puts them together in a house that you can actually go live in and enjoy. Because nobody wants to live on a pile of boards, and nobody wants to live on a piece of paper that has a really cool house drawn on it. We all want to live in the house. So it's this plane of manifestation where things happen. And so you end up understanding that you have three minds there too, and it's three different fields where it's a Vesica Pisces of the two things coming together, just like we talked about with where Ganunga brought together Muspelheim and Niflheim. And this is happening top and bottom also, and meeting right here in this center. So with that, I think we're probably going to go take the lunch break, and we'll come back and we'll move on to the way we're seeing the world now and what we've added on since then.
15-minute break.
Oh.
All right, Ben, continue when you're ready, please.
Hope everybody got their smokes in. All right. So, as I had said, while working on the biochemical universe, it didn't quite sit right with me with that just singular polarity. And as anybody can see from the rest of the talk, where I'm talking about three minds, it also doesn't quite sit right. So one of the areas that I worked on the most, and where this first really started coming together for me then, was the heart center. And I was talking with somebody about the heart, and I was explaining how, once again, just like when I was talking about Mercury, the heart's doing two very different things. The blue side, which is going to be your copper side, copper pulls in hydrogen and it pushes away oxygen. This is part of why copper doesn't really oxygenate very well. Where now iron, your red side, is pulling in oxygen and pushing out hydrogen. And so these two things are moving these elements back and forth through your system as your body needs it. It needs to take in the oxygen and then push it out to expel it. And the same thing with the hydrogen, so these things can be useful. Now, then when you start matching that up with the luminaries, especially the wandering stars, well, that's not vertical from each other in that system, as we would normally expect. Those two would then become a polarity that is actually creating one heart center or one chakra, or as when we looked at the tree of life previous to this, one eye. And that's going to be your ego eye. And that's where these two fields are playing off of each other. And so that's going to be one thing. Well, then that led me back up to immediately the brain center. And in the brain center, in all kinds of different cosmologies also, they look at the cerebrum as the gold and the cerebellum as the silver. And the same thing here happens with the minerals, the salts of salvation in the zodiac. When he's talking about the way the mineral salts your cellular salts start filling into the fluid. You start out with the gold of the cerebrum, and then you fall to the silver of the cerebellum, and then it continues on down the system. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum are two different things. You're talking about gold and silver, or the sun and the moon, or your upper system. So the gold and the silver are a polarity off of each other, the same as the heart center was. And those two are creating their own field. We all understand from the different cosmologies that the cerebrum is the different thought, that's the pure side, and then the cerebellum is your action side, your goat side. Well, then the entire system starts going down and moving down from there and developing. Now, when you look at this layout, then it's fairly easy to see that Mercury then is the transition between that upper region, or the God region, where all the metals, well, let me back up, we forgot Polaris. Polaris, like we talked about right before the break. So with Polaris then as the crown, Polaris descends into the sun and the moon. And all these are your non-degrading compared to everything else. They're your platinum level elements, your God elements. And everything below the Mercury line on the body then, iron, copper, tin, lead, these are all mundane metals. So Mercury's the transition energetically between this God level and the mundane level. And so then you're going to fall into the iron and the copper of the heart, or Mars and Venus. And there's all kinds of different stories depending on which mythologies you're looking at, where copper, where Mars and Venus are either having an affair or fighting. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. The Mars side's, again, the degradatory side, just like with the moon. When we made the moon the masculine side degrades. The war side, the oxygen side, is degrading things, where the hydrogen side is incorporating things and giving back and giving the love. So that masculine side, and then we're going to drop down into your solar plexus, which is going to be represented by Jupiter or tin. Now from there we drop down into another polarity that we're going to see in all kinds of different mythologies. Well, this is going to be the Saturn, which most of us identify with lead, and that one's fairly well known. Well, Saturn had his war at the very beginning, then with aluminum or Uranus. And this is going to be your sacral chakra, your root eye, that red eye from the other tree at the bottom. Now, here's where I came into a real problem, because Uranus and aluminum was hard enough to find. There's not too many references to that. But Neptune, there is no reference to as far as metals goes, which is a very interesting thing. So I contacted Crow 777, and he contacted Fortune Saint Germain and some other friends, and they all got together, and we were all working on this. So then for the root, it came up with lithium. And lithium is absolutely interesting and amazing in this entire system, because first, lithium, it regulates the way your body takes in salts. Anybody that's actually had to take lithium, you know that the amount of hydration that you had, which specifically only means hydrogen, not water, hydrogen itself, the amount of hydration that you have, that lithium severely starts affecting that, and you start getting really weird, especially out in heat when you start getting dehydrated, because it regulates the way your body accepts salts. So that was super interesting. And then the other one that I had to work with them on was Polaris, where Polaris we brought in as titanium. And I'd already been thinking titanium or platinum. Obviously platinum, because everything up there was platinum level elements, so obviously platinum, the mother of the platinum level elements. But it comes out titanium, which is, we'll get to in just a minute. It ends up being a really super neat trick. So I knew it was one of those because that's a white light. And the white light then, down here for your root, you're going to have black. And so all the colors are white, and it's going to fractalize and divide, and you're going to have all your colors in between the two areas. So then at your root is black. So all the colors exist in between. They're all fractals of the same thing. And as we see when we looked at the tree of life in and of itself, when you broke it apart into 3 pieces, is all fractals of each other, or as above, so below. Everything works the same. So then when we start looking at the way energy flows, what we've set up now here is 3 polarities. And each one of these polarities, each one of those eyes, is its own thing. Just like when we did alchemy and we separated it in the sulfur and the salt and the oil, each one of those separates in its own component pieces. It functions all by itself. Each one of these things does. So we come to a battery setup, and this is my battery setup. It's pretty old. It's been about time to replace it. Entirely different talk on what I'd like to replace it with and whatnot. Lead acids aren't the most efficient at this point, but that's again another thing entirely. So I run off of, again, I live off grid, and I've got 40 solar panels. Well, I've got a 48 volt inverter. And what inverter's doing is it's flip-flopping amps and volts, because amps and volts are inversely proportional. So that's taking this and making it into taking my volts and jacking them up and lowering my amps and making it into a usable voltage, even though I've got actually technically less amperage to do the work. But it'll work at higher voltage. Well, obviously, because they're inversely proportional, the higher you can start out that equation. Instead of having a 12 volt inverter, I've got a 48 volt inverter. So these batteries are 6 volt batteries. It's a pretty typical battery. You find them in the back of golf carts or whatever. They're called an L16 lead acid battery. Work just like the battery we were talking about at the beginning. Real simple. Well, 6 volts obviously won't run a 48 volt system. So what I'm going to have to do then is I'm going to have to connect, and as you can see, these wires, they're going crisscross across each other, dink, 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 dink. And what's going on there is the positive terminal on one side is getting connected to the negative terminal on the other side. And while, most people would immediately think that that's going to shock the hell out of you, that's really not the case. What that does is that adds those voltage, and this is called a series. And it adds those 2 voltages together. So now if I take 2 of those and I do that just once, I'm going to turn that into a 12 volt battery, and I've still only got one open positive and one open negative because that jumper wire is covering the other 2 and connecting them together. So now those 2 batteries are really essentially one battery. Now then you turn around, again, I've got a 48 volt system, so I have to do that 8 times with each one of these batteries. So this is connected positive to negative, and 8 times until it reaches 48 volts. And now that I'm at 48 volts, I have 1 battery. Well, then as you can see, there's 3 banks of that. So that 1 battery, it's only got so many amp hours, so much duration that it's going to be able to run anything. And so if I want to do that longer, I'm going to have to put more batteries in parallel with this series, which again, those are going to have to be series batteries. So this is what you call a series battery, or a series parallel battery setup. Here it is a little bit cleaner for you to see, where this one's just a 24 volt system. They've put these 2 12 volts together, and now it makes a 24 volt system. Then you look on the bottom, this is called a series parallel, where we have 2 24 volt systems, but now the positives of that side and the negatives of that side, just like on my battery, are all going to one spot. Now that's going to add up the amp hour. So I've got now, instead of just 1 battery, I'm able to pull off of, I've got 2 batteries, and in my case, I've got 3 batteries, which is really interesting because this is what we're looking at with the human body. We're looking at three batteries that are just sitting in series with each other. And this is why your Kundalini energy flows like that, because what you've got is three series, and this is actually an ancient caduceus, the picture that we have up on top here, where it's got three fields, and one side is going to be magnetic and one side is going to be dielectric, and they're going to flip-flop at the heart. The heart's an extremely weird spot, and we're going to get to that in just a second when we're looking at these metals that were representative. It flip-flops there and goes back. So we get an oscillation and then an overall oscillation from top to bottom. So, and here's another ancient representation where you can see it's got the three different fields. Well, when you're looking at the normal, just the singular snake like this, it's just not got the other side wrapped into it. And you can see they're not making the full loops, because then once you put the other one in, it does end up making the full loop. And this is going to create a dipole magnet. And as you can see from this drawing right here, and unfortunately the Weaving Spiders did make a live 3D one with lights, and it was absolutely amazing to see this in person, where you could literally see that dipole magnetic field where Austin was just showing you in the previous talk, and you see that just pop up and come to life, and why that's happening. So we end up having, up one side you have the energetic field, and then the other side. Well, as these pass the gold of the brain and the titanium of the crown, a very interesting anomaly happens. So where all these metals above the mercury line are not magnetic, when you mix titanium and gold, it's the only first known anti-ferromagnetic metal. So it's mixing two non-metallic metals and making an and ferro is just iron, metallic metal, and you're making a ferromagnetic metal out of it, rather than just non-magnetic, where typically it's not really recognizing a magnetic field, it pushes it away ever so slightly. So when these two mix together, it actually makes a magnetic effect, and the snake head right here energetically is going to snap over and bite the tail, where again we're having a really weird effect between the aluminum and the lithium, where we're getting another anomaly where it's turning dielectric, and these two are going to now meet, and the entire energetic field is going to turn more into a circle rather than just linear. And this is where we're going to get our whole toroid field, where these two are meeting, and this is all getting generated off the heart, where the plane of inversion is, where you have the iron, which is, of these metals, the only one that's ferromagnetic, the only one that's truly magnetic, and if you hit it with a charge, it wants to hold magnetic field. And then you have copper, which isn't magnetic, but it should be. So it reacts pretty weird against a field, energetic field like that, and it just starts making these giant fields, which is part of why we're using it in almost every generator in the world, because where these two meet, these two polarities are smashing together, and it actually creates a void or a cavitation, and that's where the spark's coming out of that, which is again representative of the All-Mother. When we say ether, ether is all the fluid or vapor or anything like that all these transitions are happening in between, but that's just on our level, the way we understand it, because we can't live in the immaterial side, the Gununga gap. We live on the material side, so we can't understand the feminine. That's why it's such a mystery. But it does show up, and it brings life. It brings that spark. Where those two things are meeting, you have that spark, that cavitation, and now this whole system's driving, and it turns the entire thing into a magnetic dipole toroid. and it's absolutely fantastic. And just here, Austin had a lot better pictures, so I had some live ones, but I couldn't get them over off my phone. But we can see just the way the vortex in, the vortex out, the diamagnetic side, the magnetic side, and the toroid that they're creating. And here's where you're living. The field, the plane of manifestation. Because again, just like with we were talking about with alchemy before. Oops. Oh, and yeah, here's the DNA chain, which again you can see looks just like that. It would look just like their 3D representation that had the lights on it. But here's the DNA chain, which once again you can put, science understands a lot of these things. They just go wrong, go a little bit sideways a lot of times. But this ends up making the snake head bite the tail, creating the whole field, and that's about it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ben. Fascinating stuff. Next, we are going to have Marty leads, so just a small intermission while we get Marty set up, and then we'll have Marty leads.